Martha, a 23-year-old kitchen slave in Louisiana, who ground emerald glass into powder the morning her master married another woman. The air was already thick before sunrise, heavy with heat and quiet resentment. She sat by the window, her breath steady, her hands moving in rhythm over the mortar. Grind, turn, grind. The shards sparkled like tiny stars, catching bits of dawn's first light. Each fragment held a memory, a night of screams, a morning of bruises, a lifetime of orders. The plantation still slept, its white columns wrapped in mist. The only sound was the hum of insects and the rasp of glass beneath her pestle. In a few hours, the house would wake to laughter, music, and the scent of magnolia. There would be toasts, blessings, and a bride in lace. But before that, Martha would finish her work, quiet, precise, deliberate. Her heart no longer trembled. It had calcified into purpose. Before we start, let's connect with each other. Comment below. Where you from watching this video, and what's time there? Every turn of her wrist was a prayer. Every grain of powder a piece of her story. For years, she had been used. Her labor, her body, her silence. But this morning, her silence meant something else. It was the stillness before a storm, the pause before truth takes form. The broken Bordeaux bottle she'd hidden for months now lay in pieces small enough to swallow. The same wine he had once poured for himself and spilled on her skin in mockery would become the instrument of his ending. The irony wasn't lost on her. Outside, a rooster crowed. Inside, she lifted the mortar and watched the fine green dust shimmer like ground emeralds. Somewhere deep inside, she felt Delilah's voice, her daughter's ghost, whispering through the air. Make him taste what we've known all our lives. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, and for the first time in years, she felt something like peace. Today, her labor would not serve cruelty. It would deliver it. She poured the powder into a small cloth, tying it tight, as the first light crept across the kitchen floor. She looked toward the grand house and whispered, almost tenderly, "The glass will speak for me now." And it would, in a language he would finally understand. Thornfield stood like a cathedral of cruelty, grand, white, and rotting beneath its shine. The field stretched for miles, thick with cotton and sorrow. From dawn to dusk, the air carried the weight of command, the overseer's whip cracking like thunder. The endless murmur of "Yes, Master Thornfield," inside the kitchen. The walls sweated from heat and labor. Iron pots clanged, fires hissed, and hands blistered. Trembling moved faster than breath. Martha's were among them, steady, obedient, scarred. Each day began with the same rhythm, the sound of knives on wood, the hiss of grease, the bark of orders from men who never lifted a finger. The White House above her glowed in the morning sun, a monument to manners built on misery. Jeremiah, the head servant, rushed through the kitchen with panic in his eyes. The master's wedding was hours away, and every mistake meant punishment. "Move faster," he whispered, not out of cruelty, but survival. The wedding guests, rich planters and painted women, would dine beneath chandeliers, lit by the sweat of the enslaved. They would toast to love, to new beginnings, blind to the fact that every plate, every drink, every polished spoon carried the fingerprints of those they owned. Martha moved quietly through the chaos. To most, she looked calm, another shadow in a world built on routine. But beneath her stillness lived something else, a storm years in the making. Every scar on her back was a memory, every burn on her hands a verse and a prayer she could never speak aloud. Thornfield was a place where silence kept you alive. Yet silence had begun to rot inside her. Every clang of metal, every echo of laughter from the parlor above, scraped against something raw in her soul. She had served faithfully. She had obeyed every command. But each "yes, master" now tasted like ash. The plantation's rhythm continued. Same sounds, same pain. But somewhere deep within the kitchen, Martha's heartbeat had found a new rhythm. It no longer followed orders. It was preparing for reckoning. The kitchen air was thick with heat and memory. Each motion Martha made, measuring, stirring, folding, felt like walking through ghosts. The sugar sparkled beneath the lamplight, but she saw none of its sweetness. To her, it was the taste of something long stolen. With every handful she poured, she remembered laughter that used to belong to her, and a mother's hand that once brushed the flour from her cheek. The butter came next, soft and pale, melting under her fingers. It reminded her of the softness that Thornfield had burned out of her. 14 years old, dragged from her mother's arms in the New Orleans market, sold like livestock. The air that day had smelled of sweat, salt, and despair. She could still hear the auctioneers chant, still feel the rough rope biting her wrists. Thornfield had been young, then hungry, ambitious, learning how cruelty could command respect. His voice still echoed inside her head. "You'll learn your place, Martha." She had learned, but not in the way he thought. Each lash of the whip had written lessons across her skin, lessons in patience, not obedience. Beneath her apron, the scars ran like secret maps, each one marking time, and as she worked, they seemed to pulse, alive beneath the sweat. She cracked an egg, its shell split, fragile and final. The yolk bled into the bowl, golden and trembling, just like the hearts that had been broken in that house. Martha stirred slowly, her hands steady, even as her thoughts trembled. The rhythm of the spoon against the bowl became something sacred, a heartbeat, a ritual. She thought of Isaiah, the boy who had smiled even when beaten, Samuel, the man who whispered freedom before his last breath, and the women who never got names, who disappeared into the soil behind the smokehouse. Their memories clung to her like the scent of burning fat, and in this kitchen, she carried them all. Every motion had meaning now. The sugar for innocence lost, the butter for false kindness, the eggs for lives cracked open and discarded, and the flour for the dust of bones that fed the cotton fields. She didn't cry anymore. Tears were for those who still believed someone might care. The bowl before her shimmered, pale and thick, a reflection of everything she'd survived. Her silence was no longer submission, it was strategy. Every ingredient she touched drew her closer to something inevitable, and as the fire in the stove hissed and spat, a quiet thought flickered behind her eyes. When the right time came, no one at Thornfield would taste sweetness again. Delilah was 16, bright as morning, soft-spoken, with eyes that carried more hope than the world ever offered her. The kitchen girls used to say she was born with sunlight in her smile, that even the overseers paused when she sang. But in Thornfield's house, beauty was never a blessing. It was bait. Martha had tried to protect her, to keep her close, to hide her under layers of chores and shadows. But desire has its own map, and Thornfield always found what he wanted. One evening, as the house prepared for another dinner, the master's gaze lingered too long. Martha saw it, the look that had preceded every cruelty she'd ever known. She dropped to her knees, hands clasped, whispering, "Take me instead." But mercy was not a language Thornfield understood. The next morning, the kitchen was quieter than usual. Delilah didn't sing. By dusk, she could barely walk. Martha washed the blood from her daughter's dress in silence, her hands trembling as crimson threads bled into the basin. Thornfield called it fever. He even signed a paper, neat and official, declaring her death an act of God. But Martha knew better. She had seen too many graves and too much hypocrisy to believe in coincidence. They buried Delilah beneath the old oak tree where children used to play, the same one that shaded the fields during harvest. No marker, no name, just earth and silence. Martha pressed her palm into the dirt and whispered something no one else could hear. That night, the air around the plantation changed. It felt heavier, as if the land itself mourned. When dawn came, the fields resumed their rhythm. The overseers shouted. The work resumed. Life, for everyone else, went on. But inside Martha, something had shifted forever. The woman who once bowed her head now carried a stillness sharper than any blade. From that day, she began to collect her rage, like rainwater, slow, patient, deliberate. Every insult, every command, every memory became a drop in the vessel of her silence. By the time it was full, she would know exactly what to do with it, and in her apron pocket, she started keeping something small, white, sharp, and glimmering beneath the lamplight. Sugar, but not for sweetness. For memory. For revenge. The morning of the wedding rose bright and cruel, sunlight spilling over Thornfield Plantation, like a lie polished to perfection. Inside the grand house, laughter floated through the hall, silk rustling, glasses clinking, guests arriving in their finest illusions. But deep in the kitchen, where the air smelled of heat and labor, something else was being born. Martha stood over the wooden table, steady as stone. She measured flour with slow precision, every movement deliberate, almost reverent. Around her, the other servants rushed, Jeremiah barking orders, pots clanging, the overseer's boots echoing down the corridor. But Martha heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the mixing bowl before her and the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. In her apron pocket, the powdered glass waited. It pulsed like a hidden heartbeat, the dust of emerald and vengeance ground fine as sugar. When she slipped her hand inside and touched the cool grains, her pulse stilled. She thought of Delilah, her laughter, her grave beneath the oak hand of Thornfield's voice, smug and unrepentant. The memory no longer hurt, it instructed. She folded the powder into the golden batter, her motions smooth, silent. The crystals vanished into sweetness, invisible and absolute. As she stirred, she whispered words she hadn't spoken since childhood, syllables from her grandmother's tongue, words that once called storms and spirits. They carried through the air like smoke, like prayer. Each turn of the spoon was a vow. For a moment, she imagined the ancestors watching the women who'd worked these same kitchens, whose names were lost but whose pain lived on in the walls. She could almost hear them. The drums of memory, faint and distant, and over them Delilah's voice, tender but sure, make him pay. The kitchen light dimmed as clouds passed overhead, though no one else seemed to notice. Martha moved like someone outside of time. Her hands no longer trembled. Her eyes no longer wept. She had become something beyond flesh, something ancient, calm, inevitable. To anyone looking in, she was just a woman baking a wedding cake. But within that act was scripture. Each layer stacked like verses of rebellion, each swirl of icing, a sermon in disguise. This wasn't ragged, was restoration. The balance of suffering measured in spoons and silence, and when she stepped back to look at her work, the cake gleamed in the dim light, soft and perfect, its surface smooth as peace itself. This is not murder, the voice inside her said. It is balance. The music swelled inside Thornfield Hall, soft violins gliding over laughter and the clinking of crystal. Chandeliers blazed above tables crowded with silver and wine, casting their light on faces flushed with celebration. The air shimmered with perfume and privilege, and at the far edge of it all, half hidden in the shadow of a curtain, stood Martha's island, still, invisible as ever. From the kitchen's fire to the ballroom's glow, she had crossed a world divided by cruelty. Her apron was gone now, replaced by plain linen, but her hands, those same hands that had stirred sugar and glass into one final truth, still trembled faintly at her sides. Each note of the music pierced her like a memory. Thornfield stood before the crowd, his new bride gleaming beside him like the promise of a gentler future. His voice carried easily through the rooms, smooth, confident, dripping with self-congratulation. And none of this, he said, gesturing toward the feast, would be possible without the faithful hands that built this home, without Martha's loyal service. Faithful, loyal. The words rang like shackles. Guests nodded approvingly, smiling at the noble master who thanked his servant. But in Martha's mind, every syllable struck like the crack of a whip. For 23 years she had given him everything: blood, sweat, the child he destroyed. And now he called it devotion. The laughter that followed was bright, hollow, endless. But beneath that laughter, something else was stirring. The air felt heavier, charged, as though unseen eyes filled the room. Spirits of the forgotten lingered near. The men and women whose names had been buried in the soil. Outside these walls, Samuel, Isaiah, Delilah, their presence was quiet but undeniable. Woven into the flicker of the candles, the shifting of the air. Martha felt them, watching, waiting. Thornfield turned to the table. "Shall we?" he said, smiling for the guests. The silver knife gleamed as he lifted it, catching the chandelier's light. He placed it to the cake's edge. Pressing through the soft layers Martha had built with trembling calm, the blade slid through sugar and glass. The sound barely a whisper, ode-like judgment in her ears. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition. This was the moment she had crafted grain by grain, prayer by prayer. The guests applauded as Thornfield offered the first slice to his bride. Martha's eyes didn't follow it. They stayed fixed on the knife, still glinting in his hand. The very symbol of power, turned instrument of balance. No one saw her then. Not really. Just a woman in the background, her expression unreadable, her silence unremarked. But inside her, the weight of years settled into stillness. The hall was filled with joy and music, but beneath it, something older had awakened. The laughter wouldn't last long. As the first bite touched his lips, justice began to rise. The knife had barely touched the last slice when the room filled with applause. Thornfield grinned, lifting a fork crowned with sugared white cake. Laughter floated through the air, fragile as the crystal chandeliers overhead. The bride leaned toward him, eyes glowing with naive devotion. He cut a smaller piece, offered it to her lips, and for a fleeting second, everything shimmered in false perfection. No one noticed the faint glint beneath the icing. No one, except Martha. She stood behind the guests, her hands clasped neatly, her expression carved from calm. The hall was drenched in gold light, every movement polished for beauty. Thornfield lifted another forkful, this time for himself. The silver flashed once, before it disappeared between his teeth. The room exhaled with him. One long, satisfied sigh of celebration. Then came the pause, a blink, a slight twitch in his jaw. Thornfield's hand went still over his plate. A cough broke the music's rhythm. Just one, then another, deeper, harsher, impossible to disguise. His bride's laughter faltered as a crimson bloom spread across her laced bodice, like a secret spilling open. The guests froze, their smiles collapsing into horror. A servant dropped a tray. Glass shattered on marble. The violinist stopped mid-note, bow hanging in the air. Thornfield stumbled backward, clutching his throat as his face turned the color of ash. His bride screamed his name, but her voice barely reached him. Martha did not move. Her eyes followed him the way one watches the tide recede, slow, steady, inevitable. He gasped, fell to his knees, and the sound that came from his throat was the same choked gurgle that had haunted her nights for years. The same sound her daughter made when breath deserted her body under his cruelty. The room dissolved into panic, chairs scraping, voices shouting for help, a preacher praying. Yet beneath the chaos lay a strange, heavy silence. It wasn't triumph that filled the air. It was finality. Justice, it seemed, had arrived without an announcement. And in that quiet, as Thornfield's body stilled, Martha simply stood. No tears, no laughter, just stillness, the kind that comes when something dark and sacred has run its course. Justice, after all, does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. The hall that once glowed with laughter now reeked of wine, sweat, and fear. Thornfield's body had barely cooled when the overseers began shouting names. their boots echoing through the corridors like gunfire. Every servant was dragged from their quarters, questioned, slapped, or shoved until someone broke, but no one spoke her name. Not at first. By morning, the panic had spread across the fields. The sugar mill was silent. Even the horses seemed restless. Every overseer demanded answers, but there were none that satisfied. It had to be one of them, they said, one of the kitchen hands. Martha stood still through it, outcome composed, her eyes fixed somewhere no one else could see. When they seized her wrists and demanded she speak, she didn't resist. She only whispered, "I baked what he fed us for years." Some swore that was her confession. Others said she never uttered a word. Maybe both were true. Her silence carried its own kind of defiance, an answer sharper than any blade. As Thornfield's coffin was lowered beneath the magnolia tree, the white families wept for what they called a tragedy. But in the slave quarters, a low hum rose from the shadows. It wasn't mourning. It was something older, deeper, a hymn of deliverance. Women rocked their children to sleep to the rhythm of her name. Men whispered her story like scripture. By nightfall, word had already reached the next plantation, then the next. A woman had poisoned her master and faced death without fear. Martha's name traveled faster than the patrol riders, passed between field hands like a secret blessing. Her fate was sealed long before the trial. Everyone knew what the verdict would be, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what she left behind, a story that couldn't be buried, a story that turned fear into fire. In the weeks that followed, her legend grew. Some said they saw her spirit in the fields at dusk, watching, waiting. Others said she was gone, but not forgotten, proof that justice, even in chains, could still find its way through a woman's steady hands and in the hearts of the enslaved. Her quiet vengeance lived on. Martha had not shouted. She had not begged. Yet she had spoken louder than anyone ever dared. In the old records, her name is little more than a line in faded ink. A servant who poisoned her master. No mention of the years of cruelty. No mention of the daughter buried before her time. Just a crime, stripped of reason, buried under lies. But the truth has a way of surviving in whispers. Long after the plantation crumbled, long after Thornfield's descendants sold the land and scattered to the winds, the people still remembered. In the slave quarters that once rang with her quiet footsteps, mothers told their daughters by the glow of dying candles, "Don't forget Martha's cake." They spoke of it like scripture, not story. The cake wasn't just a dessert, it was a sermon baked in secret, a symbol of what happens when silence learns to fight back. And in that story, Martha stopped being a victim. She became a warning, a myth, a hymn of resistance that no overseer could silence. Even as time marched on, and the world changed its face, her legend lingered. Some said that when glass shatters in a kitchen, when a bowl slips, or a window breaks, it's Martha reminding us that sweetness and vengeance once shared the same breath. That freedom, sometimes, comes dressed as death. The ruins of Thornfield still stand somewhere, covered in moss and memory. Travelers say the air feels strange. They're quiet, but alive, as if the land itself remembers what was done, and by whom. The wind through the broken windows sounds almost like a whisper, soft but certain. She baked sweetness into death, it says, and death into freedom. Martha, the kitchen slave from Thornfield Plantation in Louisiana, who poisoned her master with glass baked into his wedding cake, left behind more than a death. She left behind a question. Was she a murderer? Or was she a mother seeking justice in a world that gave her no other language to speak? The screen fades to black, but her story doesn't. It lingers, heavy, unsettling, because in her silence there was truth. In her act there was clarity. She did what no law, no prayer, no mercy could do. She made the world stop and look. Some call her a killer. They read the records and see only crime. But those who understand the soil she walked, the whips she heard, the nights she survived, they see something else. They see a woman who buried her daughter beneath an oak tree and then buried her fear beside her. A woman who turned her suffering into symmetry. The narrator's voice lowers, almost to a whisper. When justice is outlawed, vengeance becomes a kind of grace. It's not a defense, it's a reckoning. Because what choice did she have? To endure, to kneel, or to act? The story doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't need to. It asks for reflection, for the courage to see how systems of evil twist morality until even goodness must wear a darker face. As the film ends, the camera drifts down to the ground, the dirt, where it all began. There, half buried, lies the broken Bordeaux bottle, the one that once held the powdered glass. Its fragments shimmer faintly in the light, like scattered stars, and for a fleeting moment, the earth itself seems to breathe, whispering the same question that history still cannot answer. Was she wrong, or was she finally free?